Institute for Northern Studies public seminar series. My name is Dr. Andrew Lind, and it's my great pleasure to be chairing these sessions. Tonight we've got a very special session for us. We are joined by Stefan Nyzell and Thomas Smaberg from Malmö University for a special session about Vikingisms, and we'll be spending the next hour or so discussing exactly what we mean by that. So this is very much hopefully going to be a discursive session. We're going to have lots of time for questions and some discussion after the two papers, which should roughly last about 20 minutes each. I would ask that everybody will be muted and their cameras will be switched off initially during the session, but I'm going to allow everyone to switch on their cameras and their microphones once the two papers have been given. In the meantime, if you have that burning question and you don't want to lose it, feel free to fire it into the chat. So just as a reminder, the session is being recorded and we will be uploading this onto our department YouTube channel, so you can relive all the fun again at your leisure. So if you do not want to appear on the recording, just make sure that you keep your camera off at all times. So with no further ado, I will hand over to our two guest speakers this evening, and I think, Stefan, you're going to kick us off. So I'll just get your slides on screen.
Thank you.
Seconds. This is a lot harder to do on this laptop. There we go. And there we are.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Thank you for letting us come here and do this seminar. And I will kick off then. And I title my part of the presentation Viking reenactment in Northern Europe, circa 1960 to 2025. And what I'm going to do here today is sort of two parts here. The first part is that I'm going to talk about this book that you see on the screen. It came out last year. It's titled Viking Heritage and History in Europe, Practices and Recreations. And I was co-editor on that book with Sir Els Nilsson. And we had quite a lot of contributors here. And it was summed up by Professor Howard Williams, Professor of Archaeology in Great Britain. He said we need a new field study that he called Vikingisms. So that's the theme for today's seminar. And I'm going to say something about what that could be. And for my part, I've been studying historical recreation, historical reenactment for a couple of years now. And my part in this book was called Viking Re-enactment, simply enough. So the second part, the first part is going to talk about my sort of contribution in this book. And the second part is really that I now think about continuing on this track. So it's really a sort of outline for a new research project. So I would be happy to hear your comments and ideas and so on. So I will end with sort of where to go further on then. So yeah, let's go. Oh, it works. Yeah, so a short history of Vikingisms. I don't want to stay on this slide too long, but I will state one thing. For me as a historian, history is not the same thing as the past. History is always traces of the past in selection and interpretation. So we can see two lines here. We have the line above, which is the sort of chronological time from the past into the present and future. History is the second arrow below here, and that's another thing than the past. So it's always an interpretation. And in that, we as historians or academics, we tend to sort of compartmentalize the past. So we can talk about the Viking Age, for example, and the idea of the Viking Age, as we most of course know, is an invention from the 18th century and so on. And when we're talking about Vikingisms, this is the third arrow. It's a sort of one part of the arrow of history here, and it's Vikingisms then. So Vikingism is basically, for me, the same things as medievalism, but we focus on the Viking era and how that has been portrayed in the post-Viking times. So to make a long history short, Vikingism for me is the Viking age in selection and interpretation since the Middle Ages. We can start during the Viking Age with sort of Alcuin and Snorre and etc., and then onwards through natural romanticism and so on up until today, when you can play Assassin's Creed Valhalla, for example, as a historical reenactment and so on and so on. And for me, what I study in this context of Vikingism is Viking reenactment. And you can do that. You can study history as an academic, of course. You can also use history, and not only use history, you can produce history and mediate history in the public arena. And for me, that's what reenactors do. They are public historians, as I see it. Okay, so first off, I'm going to define historical reenactments as I see it, the way I use it when I do research then. For me, historical reenactment, or I mean, you can also do archaeological reenactment, of course, if you are into that. It's an attempt to recreate some aspect of the past. And it's about temporal process in which the past is interpreted, envisioned, materialized, and or embodied. And it's done in performances that ensure meaning for the participants, but the present is always the primary situated temporality. So the present is always the primary situated temporality. That's important. So reenactors not only consume history and the past, but also produce and mediate knowledge about the past. They are public historians in my view. A reenactment then is ultimately about the asynchronic temporality, or as Carol Dinshaw says, different time frames or temporal systems colliding in a single moment of. It's all about bringing the past into this present time. So for me, I don't really like the term time travel that's often used. For me, it sends the wrong signal. We don't go back in time, but we conjure up the past into the present. And that's a main thing, I think, talking about reenactment, as it's a conjuration, if you see that. And here I use Raphael Samuels as one of my theoretical starting points, and Samuel says then that history is not the prerogative of the historian. It's a rather social form of knowledge, drawing not only on real life experience, but also memory, myth, fantasy, and desire. And for me, one of the key aspects on this sort of research is I want to understand the desire for the past, the desire for history. I think that's a key insight we need to study more as historians. So talking about Viking reenactment or reenactment, I see it as two distinct but overlapping subgenres. On one hand, we have a sort of grassroots bottom-up practices of Viking reenactment. It's initiated by hobbyists as a recreational pursuit. It has since the late 1960s grown steadily in numbers of both individuals and groups. As you can see here is an example of a grassroots bottom-up. Reenactors, individuals and groups doing their stuff simply. But we also have institutional top-down practices of Viking reenactment. At the same time as the grassroots bottom-up has grown, it has also been done from above, so to say, initiated by professionally trained historians and or archaeologists from either university departments or cultural heritage institutions. And the number of recreated Viking sites using reenactors has grown steadily since the 1960s, I would say. This is an example. It's Erik studied in Iceland, on the westland of Iceland. So recreated Viking farmhouse, Erik de Wet's farmhouse, actually. And of course, this has not happened without major interactions between the top down and the bottom up. And in many of these sites, there have been synergies between these sort of viewpoints or subgenres. And a lot of important things has happened and developed in these sort of meeting points. I also see reenactment, or reenactment really, in sort of realistic fantastic spectrum. The sort of idea for this comes from David Matthews and his book Medievalism, A Critical History, where he states that in the early 21st century, the most varied ways of setting of reenactment practices can be found in a spectrum ranging from the realistic to fantastic. And that gave me an idea when I wrote this article in this book, that you can set this up as a sort of a map, going from the fantastic to the realistic, and identify different ways of interacting with the past, conjuring up the past. The past, of course, can be played fantastically. It can be dramatized. It can also be reconstructed, and you can sort of go from one end to the other, and you can mix this also. It's not so clear cut as it seems here. And to the left, you have the domain of academic history. Try to study history as it was. But it always is about provisional truth claims that always can be argued with and discussed and so on, and new ideas can come up here. And making this map, it's also very important for me to stress that it's not better or worse to be on either end of the scale. You can absolutely do fantastic interpretation of the past, and that's just really very, very good. So it's not about that. But as you see, you can have a idea here. I would say that's a very fantastic, playful take on the Viking past, of course. And you can have sort of museum interaction with children and so on, trying to sort of instill an idea of the Viking Age, playing the Viking Age, but in a way that's sending a sort of message about the past. And you can have these reenactors really into sort of almost like experimental archaeology. And then, of course, on the far left, you have the museums, the museum sites and the academic sites that sort of really are experimental archaeology and so on and so forth. So you can have the whole scale here. What's also interests me is reenactment and authority. I'm really interested in authority, both formal authority and informal authority within these groups, and between these groups and academia, for example, between the bottom-up and top-down perspectives of reenactment. Authority is something I'm into studying. And you can't meet a reenactor for many minutes before they start to talk about something like authenticity or historical correctness and so on. So that's really an important thing connected to both formal and informal authority. And here I have sort of tried to discuss both authority and the idea of authenticity by sort of building on this map I just described to you. Sort of mixing the realistic, fantastic spectrum with a spectrum from object to subject. Now I will give you some example here shortly, so bear with me here. But it makes a recreate past era that is situated. So here you have the new model that I'm working with now in my new project, where you have these two lines. You have from the fantastic to the realistic, but you have also from sort of the object material to the subject, the feelings of things. And I would argue, when I've done interviews with reenactors, that they can place themselves in different parts of this map. So you have many reenactors who's really into the sort of upper left corner here, realistic object. We are not interested in performance. If you talk about performance with many reenactors, they go very much, no, we are not into LARPing. We're not doing that. We're not performing. We are recreating the past very much materially. We are making the clothes, we're making the weapons, we are making the sort of embodiment of that, but we are not performing. But of course, you can do performance, and you can put yourself in the center here. And at the same time, when I do interviews with reenactors, they can have this perspective. We do not do performances, but at the same time, they can say that, oh, when we sat there at the campfire at night doing a whole day of reenactment, I really felt that the past was present here. I can really feel that the past was conjured up. So feelings are important, and the subject here is important too. And of course, you can do fantastic object and a fantastic subject in your reenactment. And just to give you one idea here that I would like to see, if you take this, the classic movie, the Vikings with Kirk Douglas and so on, Jens Lees, you can really do a reenactment of that. And that, I would say, would be very interesting, because here you are on the fantastic scale, right? A fantastic interpretation, a Hollywood interpretation of the Viking past. But you could really today do a reenactment of the film Viking and strive to have authenticity in making Hollywood costumes and so on. And that's one aspect that I find fascinating. I would really like to see that. I can see Thomas in a Viking helmet and so on. That would be lovely.
With horns.
With horns, of course. And that's fine. There's a play with the past, interpretive play that I find fascinating and interesting. So the fantastic part, just like Appelia, is very interesting to study, but it gives meaning to some. And that's the important thing here, I think. Yeah, and what I found out also in my interviews with reenactors, that they slowly but steadily gain expertise about the past. So many reenactors are really experts in different fields, and they really do this stuff. And many of them actually have one foot in the reenactment scene and one foot within academia. So they are talking to each other in the same person. More cases than I would have believed before I started to study this. So there is some interchanges here that's really, really interesting, I think. With that expertise, you can add layers of, or depth of expertise in this sort of map. You could more and more down, and you can get a more relative authenticity interpretation of the past, going down each layer here. So you can get really, really good stuff if you really try to make that. So for me, it's about how do I continue this, because in this article I did some interviews and I used a podcast and so on, and for me it's just a pilot to see if this is something I can take further, and I think I can do that. I think this is so interesting that I really would like to continue here. So I see a new area of research coming here. But the purpose of the new project is to examine the history and development of Viking reenactment in Northern Europe between 1960 and 2020s. And I say Northern Europe here because you get Viking reenactment all across the world. As you say here, this book is really a global phenomenon. And I can't really do everything but I think I can manage to study the northern aspects here of Viking reenactment. So that's the starting point at least. I use culture theory, with the culture as the production, circulation, and use of meaning. And I use cultural analysis as a method, and also ethnographic observations and interviews here in my common project. And I can talk a lot about culture, but I won't do that here today. But I can say that for me, the Viking reenactment scene in Northern Europe, from an institutional top-down and grassroots bottom-up perspectives, can be seen as a distinct word of meaning. And this distinct word of meaning is my subject to study them since the 1960s and onwards. So this kind of persons is of interest to me to study and to interview and do field observation with and on. And I have a couple of questions that I'm interested in to study them. I study meaning in the question areas such as the enigmatic presence of the desire and engagement with past. As I said before, just this idea of desire for past is very interesting. It's hard to pin down, but I think it's a key to understand why people are engaging with this sort of thing. And I really want to study that more. I also want to study the intriguing temporal collision between the past and the present. What happens when you conjure up the past, and what sort of feelings, and what sort of meaning does give to those doing that. I really want to study more about the importance and the presence of informal and formal learning expertise, and the forceful presence of the formal and informal authority in that expertise. So the way forward now for me, as I see it, I'm going to study top-down, institutional top-down reenactments, recreations. And I'm starting this year with ethnographical fieldwork. I'm going to do observations and interviews with staff members at historical and archaeological Viking sites and museums. That's the first thing I'm going to do now. And then I'm going to continue with grassroots bottom-up, also doing ethnographical fieldwork, observations at re-enactment events. I think about doing group interviews with Viking reenactors, both genders and across generations. See how far back the memory can go if I reach back to the 1960s, so how far back I can go here. But I like to sort of building the history here. So I have planned sites and museums that I'm going to do in June. I'm going to Lofoten, the Lofoten Viking Museum in Norway to do fieldwork. And in August, I'm going to Iceland to the Erikstader Living History Museum to do fieldwork. So I'm going to do interviews and so on, ethnographical work there. So that's my first step sort of this year, doing a pilot, and then I'm going to start applying for money for extending this project. With a research application in 2026. And I have some sites in mind that I would like to do research on, like the Ribe Viking Center in Denmark, the Viking Museum Trelleborg in Sweden, Lands of Meadows in Canada, for example. And you can help me here to give me ideas of what sort of sites I should visit. And I also have some planned events, maybe up Helgeland, maybe that's doable. Jorvik Viking Festival again, I've been there before, but going back now formally within this project. Midgårdsblot in Norway, and Haltaby Viking Summer Markets to do some field work. So that's just beginning to think about my next steps here. Yeah, that's me.
Super.
So yeah,
Thank you. I think what we'll do is we'll maybe keep all questions to the end. So if everyone's got questions for Stefan, take a note of them. And in the meantime, what we'll do is we'll just transition over to Thomas's slides and pick up some of those themes. So, over to you, Thomas.
Thank you. And I want to thank you properly and the Institute for Northern Studies for our gracious invitation to present our research here. I'm going to present a case study from a project of mine, which I previously presented here at the seminar a while ago. And I've entitled this Summer Things on Summer Days. And it's not things as in objects, but things as in Viking things. And this is the site of those summer things in the Swedish province of Bohuslän, in the town of Lysekil, where you see was a person of interest in my project called the Heathen Bronze Age Cairn, and the Christian Church, the Christian temple that perks upon the cliffs of Bohuslän. So I would talk about the construction of history, so the use of the Viking Age, which is now being called Vikingism, which is a growing field, an offshoot of medievalism. Hasn't really been properly defined at all, as far as I can see things, but we can always say that Vikingism is the study of the construction, reception, and transmission of various perceptions of Vikings, with the interplay between past, present, and future for the actors involved in Vikingism. So I will show during this presentation how an antiquities association called Vikarvet, and specifically its founder, a chap called Fredrik Nykander, used the summer thing, which was the annual meeting for the general public in Bohuslän, as a means of constructing an emotional community focused on the regional, national, and pan-national identity of Bohuslän, and the larger area called Viken, which is fairly famous in Viking Age studies as well. This then is Fredrik Nykander, the main focus of my research. He was a bon vivant. He was a playwright, an actor, a writer, and he generally preferred to be called the Bohus Skald, the Bohus Bard, and self-entitled, but he always wrote that on his notations and so forth. He actually grew up in Bohuslän, not too far from the town of Lysekil, where he then worked, but he went to Uppsala for his student days and became enamored with Vikings. He started Viking societies, of which a very famous Swedish author was a part of, Werner von Heidenstam. He talked a lot in his writings about the Aesir court, the burial mounds, and meats from the horns. So it's Vikings, Vikings, Vikings for Fredrik when he grew up, so to speak. But in the summertime, from the early 1900s, he started coming back to Bohuslän, which he loved, and to Lysekil in particular. And in 1915, he founded the Antiquities Association of Vikarvet, with the express purpose of promoting the history of Bohuslän and Viken through the Viking heritage, which he did. And this association did a lot of very interesting and worthwhile things. They conducted excavations, restorations. They even managed to rescue an abandoned church, which was very famous since they thought that it was the very first Christian church built in Bohuslän. Origin myths, basically, but still fascinating. And I mentioned that I did this with a focus on emotional communities, which is the terminology used by Barbara Rosenwein when she talks about it's a continuation of Benedict Anderson's imagined communities, with then a focus on association guilds. So it's not individual emotional here we're talking about here, it's the collective emotional communities that Rosenwein talks of. And what's interesting for me with her interpretation of this is that this is a performative nature of emotions directed at an audience and receiver, which facilitates the construction of emotional communities that are based on common values and desires. And those values and desires, they have to be constructed. And this is what Fredrik Nykander and his Vikarvet does. So you have performances, which is basically the foundation for these summer things, which I will soon come to. And these are performance rituals, but they are also performative rituals, meaning that they actually construct something. So through being here at the summer thing and both sending and receiving the messages of the emotionality that Fredrik Nykander and his something does, you will walk away from these summer things as an audience with all these emotions pouring through your head. And I will soon show what kind of emotions these then are. And it reflects very much, I think, in the oath that he wrote that you were supposed to take if you become a member of a Vikarvet. And this is my translation into English from his, even at the time, rather archaic Swedish, which he wrote. So he says, be diligent and happy, keeper of your word and friendly, honest and fair, hospitable and generous, helper of the helpless, angry with crookedness, honoring manhood, defender of women's virtue, counselor in woe, humble in good times, home-loving, kin-loving, knowledgeable of legends and myths, historian, sacred memory taker, and my absolute favorite, faithful to king and country, fearless in death. Not very many antiquities associations would consider fearless in death a prerogative for membership, but apparently Fredrik did. And as you can see from the oath, it's all about emotionality. It's all about emotion, 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 connected to the past, but also connected to his presence with a mind to the future, which is all these three time dimensions that I think Vikingisms has in common here. So this is then is the logo that he had designed for the Antiquities Association, Vikarvet. And as you can see, Viking ship in focus. And in Swedish over here in translation, it basically says light over the heritage. So it's really the past, the present, and the future even here. So you have the construction of an emotional community towards broader audience with the summer thing, because that's open to the public and free, but also the limited audience, which is what he then uses as a transmission if you are a member of the Antiquities Associations. But some things then is the central thing for this case study here. I mentioned he was a prolific writer, and he also uses that when he writes about these summer things, both in the local newspapers and then reviews himself afterwards in the same papers. And he litters Lysekil in this Bath era with these posters. Vikarvet's Day. He calls to the thing, which in itself is an emotional cry with connotations to the past, because being called to the thing was something that happened during the Viking Age as well. You send around a messenger that summoned you to the thing, and he does exactly the same. So he alludes to himself as a Viking chieftain indirectly here by using this message of emotionality when he calls to the summer thing. And an interesting part here, which is part and parcel of the performance and performativity ritual, is the location of the summer thing. You do remember, I would assume, the image I showed you, the first image I showed you, which was my own photograph of the Bronze Age cairn and the church in the background, Lysekil's church. This then is an actual photograph of one of the summer things. It's not dated, so I have no idea when it's taken, but it's the first was 1917, and he resigned as head of Vikarvet in 1928. So it's somewhere in that 10-year time frame. So you see the cairn in the background, and you see the audience, and it, obviously, as you can see, it's a fairly bourgeoisie audience here, fairly middle class, men and women, children, and so forth. That comes to this, and he has deliberately chosen this Bronze Age cairn, and he has also used Vikarvet to restore this monument, because the stones had fallen through time down from the cliffs. So they actually did restore it as well, which in itself is a performative ritual, constructing the place. So social space and social place becomes important for the performance ritual, which is the summer thing. And he also renames this. Now you call it the cairn of the Vikarvet. which is his grandiose way again of emotionalities connections to this. And he and the Viking Antiquities Association also has a membership journal that he distributes fairly broadly, which is called Tingskavlen, which basically is the log you would send around the area calling to the summer thing. And as you can imagine, the person standing on top in the silhouette, dramatically posing, is of course Fredrik Nykander. There are many images of him in profile and so forth, so clearly enjoyed being photographed. So the cairn is important. There's also actually a long cairn at the same location, which they also restored, so this is sacred ground for them to use. And they are well aware that this is a Bronze Age cairn. He mentioned it over and over again in his writing. But there circulates a postcard in Lysekil, which I just love, because here's the Bronze Age cairn, but it says Viking grave. So that's really a construction of Vikingism right there, because it's obviously fake. But if you're a tourist in the 1950s, 1920s, you'll buy this postcard. You'll write down your little summer greetings and send to your kin and family and friends, and it'll say the Viking grave in Lysekil. Perfect. So the ritual space becomes very important for these issues and these emotionality constructs. And then when it comes to the ritual of the summer thing, I've studied what little remains of the programs. I tried to puzzle the pieces together from the local newspapers, from his own writings in this Tingskavlen newspaper that he produces, and some images as well. But it's quite clear that he follows a script, and the script seems to be exactly the same from summer thing to summer thing all throughout his tenure as chairman of Vikarvet. So it starts with a horn blowing, and the person to your right here holds a horn. This is an extra from one of the Viking plays that he wrote, produced, and played in during 4 years in Lysekil from 1912, 1913 and onwards. And in all likelihood, that is the horn that was used at the summer thing. Because seriously, how many horns can there be running around in Lysekil? So I would assume this to be the same. So he allows what he calls the horn page. It's a specific person to blow the horn, usually 3 times. And it's supposed to be the summons to the thing. Then he proclaims the peace of the thing, which is also a very Viking age actual thing to have, because the thing was supposed to be protected. So when you came to the Viking thing, nobody was supposed to do violence. So that's basically what Fredrik Nykander here says. He uses history, he uses the past to his presence. So you have the horn, you have Fredrik himself proclaiming as chairman of the thing, the peace of the thing. And then you raise the flags and banners. It is also stated several times in various writings. Usually the Swedish flag, which I think is the flag that you see there, because there was other flags as well, but I think that's the Swedish flag. But there was also a Viking banner, and several variants of it. The ones you see to your left here is one that appears to be produced in the early 1930s, which is after Fredrik has left as chairman. But he says in his writings that he had made a flag in 1926. That was the first time he used it on the thing. The colors was blue and yellow, the same as the Swedish flag. So there's obviously an emotional connection here between Vikarvet, Viking history, and Sweden as a country. And on top of this banner, as is on the 1930s banner you can see here, was a sun wheel. And the sun wheel he chose as a symbol was from one of the Bronze Age rock carvings in the small village where I come from, which is famous for its Bronze Age rock carvings. And he talked about that's the most pretty sun wheel he has ever seen. So I guess I can feel a bit proud in that. I take it. So you have Bronze Age connection both with the cairn and the sun wheel and this. And the sun wheel obviously has other connotations in the 1920s and 30s as well, when it becomes a symbol of both fascism and Nazism as well. So you have the horn, you have the banners and the flags being raised. You have Fredrik stating that is now it's open for business, and then he usually has he recites from his own poems, and his own poems are full of patriotism, Swedishness, love of country. It's littered with allusions to the Viking Age. The word Viking and strongman happens all the time in his writings, both the prose and the poems that he writes. And you can, for instance, see this and in his writing. I didn't have time to translate this, I'm afraid. But this is a little thing that he wrote, because music is something that he uses quite a bit. And this talks, and now I have to put on my spectacles so I can read you in English fairly fast, about Bohuslän. In Bohuslän, the old Viking sailed over the sea to collect booty on a dragon train. So he talks about the Viking ship as a dragon. For freedom, many a hero on wall and cliff fought and bled. And the belt of the blue sea became a border in the western part. And then he goes on to speak about Bohuslän's nature. In the Bohuslän the good, the seed grows in sun and wind, and the farms are very prosperous. Then towards the end of the song, he says that I always yearn to the grey beaches, to the blooms of the hills and the snow. And as a seagull, this is where I want to go when I die. So it's quite emotional. This song is sung at everything that he presides over. But you have other music as well. On one thing, he allows the Bohuslän Regiment's orchestra to come and play, and they play very patriotic songs. One called The Viking. So he has and music plays an important part, and once again, it's all about emotionality. Another part of this, because this was an educational thing, you had to construct the community. He had speakers on various historical topics, everything from the place names of Bohuslän to the history of the island of Tjörn in Bohuslän, to a very famous 17th century aristocratic woman called Margareta Hvitfeldt. And the speakers, they could be principals from various schools and universities. They could be local historians. And on one occasion, there's even a Sea Captain Andrew McFie, a Scotsman, who talks about an estate from the 1300s called Anfasteröd. So basically, he and Vikarvet are educating the people about the correct history of Bohuslän. And it's very, very typically early 20th century perception of history that they talk about. So this is this construction then ends after these speakers, with once again Fredrik standing on the hilltop and reciting his poems about love, patriotism, Swedishness, and so forth. And he also loves to compare this past, his past, because I think I can call it his past, with the present. He talks about the First World War during the first thing in 1917, for instance, and laments the industrialization of the soldiery, and yearns back to the days when basically warriors could fight one another and just be done with it. And now this whole First World War thing is something that he abhors totally. So he has a very romantic way of viewing what masculinity and courage and war is all about. Very typical for one, I would assume, who hasn't ever seen action at all. So this then goes over into, and this are examples. You see Fredrik Nykander to your left and two of the speakers to your right. One of them is a principal, the other is a high school teacher, talking about Bohuslän to the listeners. And they're not really running for the hills, so I guess they're listening properly to what they're actually talking about. And afterwards, and this is one of the things I find absolutely fascinating that I haven't had time to study, friends of Fredrik Nykander, after his tenure as chairman, they raise a memorial plaque for him. And that's the one you see below his feet, where it basically says that here on this location, Fredrik Nykander hosted several summer things in Lysekil. So it's all about remembrance also. And this whole memory and remembrance aspect of his role is also very emotional when it comes to this. And then you have the limited audience section, where you have this, and this is the poem, the oath that I read earlier. And this is a logotype for the Tingskabel, the small newspaper / pamphlet that he himself wrote and published. And as you can see, it's so obviously a Vikingism inspired here. You see the dragons, very runic in appearance. You see two runes side by side. So he uses both imagery and language to construct this. And when you read this little pamphlet, it's very subdivided into usually his own poems. He is, as I said, a prolific writer and a very self-absorbed kind of writer as well, which I find fascinating. And small articles of anything from the restoration of the cairns, for instance, to what Viking has done for excavations and for the works, but also prosaic small articles on what it means to be a Viking. So out of perhaps 10 small articles and poems, roughly every number, I think there are 6 numbers of this Tingskabel, at least 8 of 10 of these articles and poems concerns Vikings all the time. So even though they have a broader agenda than merely the Viking Age, it's clearly dominant in his writing. So through all this, you have these emotional communities where the main focus is on some things as performance and performative ritual, and they are repetitive. They do the same thing, but that is also one of the strengths of ritual, that they do it, but they are not manuscripted, because if they had been, they would have been ceremonial in nature and not ritual in nature. Ritual in nature means by its very definition that something can happen. Interaction with the audience, usurpation of the ritual and so forth. But it's clearly emotional. And the language and the symbols, both in the speeches, in the music, in the banners that he raises, all of them helps construct this emotional community and the yearning for the Viking Age as he saw it. It's quite clear that he is the one who constructs, conveys, and transmits the idea of Viking and the Vikings in Bohuslän. So thank you very much for your attention during this short lecture.
Super. So I'm sure there'll be lots of questions, and there's already questions flooding in the chat, which is great. So what I'll just do is I will allow everyone to unmute themselves. So if you bear with me just for 2 seconds. There we go. So if people would prefer, you should now, if the spinning wheel, there we go, you should now be able to pop your camera on and unmute yourself if you want to ask a question. But I noticed that we do have a couple of questions in the chat, so I'll just read them out to get us underway. So I can get this here. The first is from Jane, a question for Stefan. Given how close it is to Malmö, why not Viking as a place? And also, are you focusing on reenactment related to settlement or including reenactment of seafaring like at Roskilde?
Good question. I have worked quite much with Viking before. When I sort of have when I will write sort of history of reenactment in Sweden, Viking will become very important. But right now, Viking is a bit of shambles. A lot of infeuding and conflict in Viking, and so I tend to avoid it right now. It will become a part of the sort of history of Viking reenactment in Sweden, and I'm sure when I interview people, they will mention Viking as a crucial part. But as for doing field work in Viking right now, I don't think that's possible, really.
Okay. We've got a question from Georgia, sorry, that I missed out there. She's got a couple of questions for Stefan, so you better get ready, Stefan.
Yeah.
First, how will you account for bias during interviews? As with many communities, the way in which different reenactors feel regarding the role, authenticity, or authority of the community in events varies greatly, depending on how they are treated or their roles within the community. I don't know if you maybe want to handle that one first.
Yeah. I mean, can I see the question somewhere? For bias during interviews, I don't really know what you mean by that. Can you develop that? But I mean, I'm not here to judge. I'm not here to say some are doing good reenactment or some are doing bad reenactment. That's the whole idea with you can do reenactment in so many different ways. What I am interested in how the community and reenactors are discussing exactly what you're writing about there. How the idea of authenticity and authority are being discussed within the reenactment community. So that's really my main topic. So I'm not really interested in anything else but just having that discussion and making that discussion happen, so to say, in the interview. So I have been doing this for some time, and I have done interviews with reenactors before, and I've written books about it too. So I tend to know what comes up here, and I'm all in favor of it, really. So bring it on.
Okay. I can see that George is furiously typing there, so I know that she'll help add to that in a second. Maybe we could just take the next point that she's raised there. So secondly, will you interview reenactors who are both academics in archaeology and part of the Viking reenactment community as a hobby, as it's an interesting overall?
Yeah, and that's the main thing, I think. And I think it's very important when it comes to authority here, because there's so many within the reenactment scene that's also you can also find within academia and within the museum sector. And one of the things that I have realized that if you go back to the 1980s, reenactment was sort of something you as an academic didn't talk so much about. It was not good to have on your CV, for example, if you applied for a job in the museum sector and so on. So it was something you tended to not talk about. But this has changed. And I find now that we have a lot of museum directors, for example, that are reenactors, and they are now in power in the museum. And that tends to change the whole idea about reenactment within the museum sector. And we have a lot of professors now that are reenactors, and they have power and authority. So this idea that I have an idea that over time reenactment has gone from being sort of an outsider arena and something not being discussed openly in academia, And now it has reversed and really becomes something that's in both the museum sector and in academia, and people in power are really there to develop this. And this is something I would like to make a part of my study, how this has changed over time. Yeah.
George has just popped in the chat there that she is a reenactor who's also an academic.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
And not Georgia. So and you are very important to this project, I think. So definitely something I want to develop further.
Brilliant. Thank you for your questions, Georgia. And also, I've just noticed that there's a question for Thomas as well from Georgia. The ceremony for the summertime reminds me of the emotional heritage reenactment loosely conducted in the ceremonial reburial of the Osberg women in 1948.
I haven't really studied that, actually. That sounds very interesting to see. But I do know that in the 1920s and 1930s and a bit into the 1940s, there are several use of ritualistic elements when it comes to the Viking Age, at least in Borre in Norway, where the Nationalsamling, the local, well, Nazi party, for lack of a better word, used Borre and the Viking graves there for their own purpose, for the annual meetings of the youth herods, for instance. So they do use a lot of emotionality there. I'm not entirely sure if it has been studied from that perspective, but I do know that there are several scholars who studied this use by Quisling of the Viking Age heritage there, and one of them, Fredrik Bonnes, I think his surname is, works at the border. He studies that quite a bit. So there's several interesting aspects of this whole place and space things that can be used. Absolutely. I'll check out the Oseberg thing. Thank you for tipping up there.
Super. I can see that Stefan's typing in the chat just now with a question, but if anyone else has a question in the meantime and they want to pop their hand up and unmute and ask.
Well, I have a question.
Donna, there you go. The hand up.
Hand up there. The question for Stefan.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering, why do you think there was such a surge of interest in Viking reenactment and things in the 1960s?
That's an interesting question, really. And I don't have a final answer. But when I read up on this, one thing that I realized that, and for example, in Sweden, Professor Bodil Pettersson has written about this. Reenactment was very much a popular thing if you back to the late 20th century, early 20th century, as Thomas talks about here. Not only in that kind of way, but also in a sort of reenactment way. So reenactment was something that was being done quite a lot, both from a top-down and bottom-up perspective, and not least in Germany. And then you got the sort of Nazi era, and the Nazis were really interested in that too, and had their spectacles and so on. So the whole idea of sort of reenacting the past got tainted by the sort of Nazi era. And after the war, it was not something that was perceived as something you should do. So both within academia, I mean, experimental archaeology was really a big thing in the 1880s and 1890s and early 20th century. But after the war, it was sort of clamped down on. And it was not until the 1960s that started again. For example, in Denmark, in Leyre, when they started up this experimental archaeological site that's still a museum. So it was sort of a time in the 1950s, there was nothing about it. Then slowly, both within academia and as a popular engagement hobby, it started up again. So it was a time where nothing was done. But before and after, yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
I see that Stefan's popped a link in to a reenactment group in Iceland, so I'll make sure to send that over to you, Stefan.
Yeah, perfect.
Thank you very much.
Alison's typing away.
Yeah, Alison's typing away as well. If there's anyone else with a question, we've probably got a couple more minutes if anyone wants to jump in. Just that I might abuse my position as I want to do. But thinking about trying to understand Vikingisms and defining Vikingisms, Stefan, you made an interesting point that you see all reenactors as public historians.
Yeah.
But Thomas, you were kind of showing not the dangers of all this, but the ways in which the past can be essentially reinvented for modern purposes.
Absolutely.
Is this something that, do you see it as something that is just, you know, this history is open to everyone and it's their opportunity to live it, reimagine it however they want? Or is this something that we as academics need to be worried about or policed in any way? Because this is something that when I've spoken to students, there's normally quite a 50-50 divide in terms of how they feel about it all.
Well, of course, history can be used. And it's being used every day for many different reasons. And I'm not seeing any more danger in reenactment than in anything else, really. But of course, uses that are very political, very sexist, very racist is of course there, as in any other use. I don't think it's really up to me, at least, to police it. I think as an academic, I have my points of view and so on, but my aim here is to understand those engaged in reenactment in basically in a different way. So if someone wants to talk about politics or religion or something with me, it's fine for me. And I mean, when I say that I'm as much interested in the sort of fantastic interpretation of the Viking past as in something that's very close to experimental archaeology, it's true. I'm interested in all this spectrum, and then you have to you can't set a barrier that you can't have Viking helms with horn, for example. I mean, of course you can if you want to. That kind of interpretation of the Viking past, and if you are going to reenact a pageant, you can reenact Thomas' case here. Then maybe the horn helmet is something that's really authentic. So it's tricky, but. My point of departure here is that I'm interested in the desire for the past. That's really my main point. I'm not a reenactor myself. I've never done it, and I feel very awkward doing it. But I can understand the people who are doing this and their desire to reconnect with the past. I mean, emotions here, I think is valid. I think there's a lot of emotions in here too. The feeling of reconnecting with the past. So I in my research, I tend to see and highlight the fact that there's a lot of people out there with a lot of expertise and there are even a huge history of the past. I tend to focus on that because I also think that academics tend to highlight what they call the misuse of history and highlight the problematic past. And of course, that's important too. But we can't only see the backsides of things. You have to also see that people are really making history in a good way too.
I think that history is weaponized throughout the ages, and so I think I take an activist view on my role as an historian. I think that, I mean, just look at the American riots in what was it, 2016, and now with the January incidents. There were several groups and individuals there that obviously used both Viking and medieval symbols in what is for me a very negative view. And so for me, and using that as a means through violence to achieve a political end, it's clearly that history is absolutely weaponized. So I think I think we have an obligation to counter those movements. I don't see myself as objective. I don't think there are objective historians. I think we are all subjective. So I would argue that you should engage with the use of history and those actors who use history.
Yeah, I suppose the fact that you've got a vehicle in terms of reenactment that is so engaging for the public, that's a really useful tool to engage and educate people as well.
I mean, just look at the Nazi era. They were really, really good in using the past to, as Thomas said, weaponize it and use it for political purposes. Of course, that's been done over and over again. but not only in that way, in many different ways, other ways too.
Okay.
Of course.
Perfect. I think we've got time for one more question, and Alison's popped it in the chat there. And Alison's asked, I have a good friend whose whole sorry, this is for Stefan. I have a good friend whose whole childhood was spent at Viking reenactments. There was 3 children, and the parents were so involved that they changed their surname of the whole family. So her surname is Hrolfsdotter, and our brother uses Hrolfsson. Is that level of submersion in reenactments that you have found in your research?
Not that deep yet, but I think definitely is there. I mean, people are naming the babies from TV series too.
Mm-hmm.
We have a lot of Daenerys from Game of Thrones. So I mean, if people get emotional and wants to sort of connect with the idea of something, they can do it and are doing it. So I'm absolutely sure that I will find that kind of things going further. Yeah.
Can imagine even to rename it Children Thor and the rest of it. That's increasingly popular, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So,
yeah.
I've always found that fascinating why you would name them after deities
Yeah.
like that. Odin, that's a terrible burden. Everybody, for whatever weedy respect.
Yeah, I just met a young boy called Loke.
Yeah.
And I don't really know what his parents thought when they named him that.
Freya is rather common as well.
Very
popular
common.
in this country.
Yeah.
I think Stefan's put a point up there.
Yeah, Stefan's popped in, which is very helpful. Thank you, Stefan. I'll make sure that Stefan, you get that as well.
Perfect.
Now, I'm conscious that the gents have very kindly given up their evenings, and we're about to take them off for dinner. So I'll wrap things up. But of course, if you have any other questions for Stefan or Thomas, I'm sure that they'd be happy to answer them on email.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You're welcome. And ideas of sites I should see and visit and so on, just bring it on.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. The last thing I need to do before I let everyone back into the wilderness is just remind everyone it's the same time and place next week. So next Thursday, we're looking forward to welcoming back to UHI Professor Frank Rennie, who's going to be speaking to us about his recent books. So make sure to join us then. But in the meantime, a massive thank you to Stefan and Thomas for giving up their evenings. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you to you all for attending, and we will see you all again next week. Bye for now.
Some nice comments there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, lots of thanks. Yeah.
Yeah.